The new Alexandria Transit Control Center smelled of recycled air and the faint chemical bite of screen cleaning solution. I settled into my chair at Console 7, logged in at 05:47, and watched the overnight schedules close out one by one. Maglev runs 12 through 18 had completed on time. Shuttle 440 from Estergom Arm had docked at the orbital platform 2 minutes early, which happened maybe twice a month. I noted it in the margin log and moved on. The morning traffic scroll loaded across my display in clean verticals. Departure times, arrival estimates, passenger counts, cargo tonnage. Everything moved in the order it was supposed to, and I liked that about this job. The way a full board read like a sentence where every word was in its correct place. 11 years I had been doing this. The system was large and complex, but it was not chaotic. It obeyed its own rules, and my job was to notice when something drifted from them. I pulled up the cargo manifest for the 0615 supply run to the medical distribution facility in Quadrant 4. Standard load. Pharmaceuticals, sealed surgical kits, diagnostic equipment replacements, the kind of shipment that moved 3 times a week without incident. But the weight index was off by 0.4% against the declared tonnage, and the routing tag showed a transfer node I did not recognize. TMC 9, I ran it against the node registry and got nothing. I checked the shipping origin, then the intermediary handler codes, and found the discrepancy in the third line. A data entry error. Someone at the origin dock had typed the node identifier from memory and gotten 2 digits transposed. I corrected it, refiled the manifest, and cleared the run. The whole thing took maybe 4 minutes. Outside the tinted glass of the control center, New Alexandria was waking up. I could see the upper transit spines catching the first daylight, the maglev rails drawing their familiar lines across the skyline. Reach had been my whole life, 31 years on this planet, and I had never once looked up at the sky and thought of it as anything other than permanent. The orbital defense platforms were up there, somewhere, doing whatever they did, and beyond them the fleet, and beyond that whatever else the military kept ready. I did not think about it much. Nobody I knew did. Reach was Reach. The safest place a human being could stand without being on Earth itself. I reached for my personal comm and opened a message to Mara. She would be getting ready for her own shift at the distribution facility. Probably running late. Probably still pulling her hair into something manageable while she looked for her transit pass. I typed quickly. Still on for dinner? That place near Arcadia Park, the one with the noodles you liked. 1900. Don't be late this time. I set the comm down and went back to the board. The 0615 supply run cleared its departure gate on schedule. Passenger traffic was building on the east-west maglev line, the usual commuter surge, and I adjusted the signal spacing to compensate for the added load. Automatic systems handled most of it, but the adjustment still needed a human eye. The algorithms were good at pattern recognition and bad at context. A 30% ridership spike at 0630 on a weekday meant commuters. The same spike at 0230 meant something had gone wrong somewhere and people were trying to get home. The system could not tell the difference. I could. Mara was 24. She worked in medical logistics, inventory tracking, supply chain coordination for the regional distribution network. It was not glamorous work, but she was good at it, and it mattered. The shipments she managed kept clinics and field hospitals stocked across 3 quadrants. I thought about her often during shifts, checking the supply runs that passed through her facility, watching the manifests scroll by, and knowing that somewhere at the other end of the line, she was counting the same crates. It was a small connection, but it was ours. The control center held 6 other coordinators at their stations, each watching their own sectors. The room was quiet in the way it always was at this hour. A few muttered confirmations, the soft input of fingers on touch surfaces. Officer Ree, 2 consoles down, was eating something from a foil wrapper that crinkled every few seconds. I had given up asking him about it. The overhead lighting was set to morning cycle, a soft white that would gradually shift toward afternoon spectrum as the hours passed. Everything in this room was calibrated. Temperature, humidity, ambient sound levels. The building maintained itself the way the city maintained itself, through accumulated small decisions made by people who understood the systems they were responsible for. I pulled the quarterly maintenance review for the east-west line and began working through it. Rail integrity reports, signal calibration logs, power distribution curves. The numbers were within tolerance across the board. I flagged 2 segments for scheduled inspection in the next cycle and moved to the next page. This was the work. Not dramatic, not visible, not the kind of thing anyone would remember. But the trains ran on time because someone checked the rails, and someone checked the person who checked the rails, and somewhere at the bottom of that chain I sat at console 7 and made sure the manifests matched. My comm chimed. Mara's reply. Noodles, 1900, I'll be there, love you. I read it twice and set the comm face down on the desk. The 0630 commuter surge hit its peak. I adjusted signal spacing again and watched the board hold steady. Outside the glass, the city moved through its morning the way it always did, and I turned back to the maintenance review, and the hours stretched out ahead of me like the rail lines on the display, running straight and predictable toward a horizon I could not yet see. The 0630 commuter surge had been over for nearly 2 hours when the first override code hit the grid, and I almost missed it. I was halfway through a maintenance review on the east-west rail line, my coffee gone lukewarm in the mug beside my keyboard, when every public shuttle slot on the board locked simultaneously. No countdown, no handoff request. The civilian scheduling system simply stopped accepting my inputs, and a string of military authentication codes I had never seen outside of training manuals scrolled across the top of my display in a language I did not speak. I tried to reassert manual control on the Quadrant 2 shuttle corridor. The system refused. I tried again, cycling through 3 authorization tiers, and each one bounced back with the same military lockout. My fingers went still on the keyboard. The board showed all 17 public shuttle lines grounded. Their status indicators changed from green to a flat, final red I had only ever seen during simulation drills. Ree's voice cut across the floor before I could process it. All coordinators, hands on your boards. Military override is live. Do not attempt to bypass. He stood at the central podium, one hand braced on the rail, reading from a display that must have been feeding him the same codes. His face had the look of a man working through a problem he had already solved in his head, but did not like the answer to. He started redirecting rail lines in quick, precise commands, rerouting the east-west corridor away from its civilian stops and onto emergency evacuation tracks I had only ever seen mapped in the system architecture documents, never activated. I fell into the work. Rail Line 7, rerouted. Rail Line 12, held at Junction 9 for military clearance. The evacuation tracks were designed for scenarios I had never imagined needing. wide parallel spurs that bypassed the city center and ran toward staging areas on the perimeter. I redirected them one by one, following Rhee's instructions, my hands doing something my understanding could not keep pace with. The grid I had spent years learning to read like weather, the grid that had felt as permanent to me as bedrock, was being reorganized around me by someone else's hand. Lena Orr worked the station diagnostics console to my left, and I registered her presence before I recognized her. She was 22, slender, with quick hands that usually carried a running commentary of complaints and observations through any shift. Today she said nothing. Her fingers moved across her board with the same speed, but none of the ease, and I watched her check a sensor feed, close it, open it again, as though the data might rearrange itself into something that made sense on a second reading. "Anything on your end?" I asked. "The military channels are cycling through directive codes faster than I can log them," she said. "I've got 14 redirected rail movements in the last 6 minutes, and none of them came through civilian dispatch." Rhee's handling the redirects from the podium. "I know. I'm just trying to keep the diagnostic record intact in case someone asks us what happened to our own system." She opened another feed, closed it, opened it again. Her hand lingered on the panel a beat too long before she moved on. The first refugee report came through the perimeter terminal relay at 0943. I caught it because I was monitoring the redirected rail lines, and the report crossed one of my feeds by accident. A transit clerk at the Azod Junction terminal was logging an unscheduled arrival, a cluster of civilians who had boarded a cargo tram from a rural depot 40 kilometers south. The clerk's notation was flat and professional. 37 passengers. No tickets. No prior authorization. Several requiring medical attention. I flagged the entry and went back to the rail redirects. Then the second report came through from a different terminal, and then a third. The pattern was the same each time. Rural departures, no scheduled runs, people arriving at city perimeter stations on cargo trams and maintenance vehicles, describing something they had seen in the sky that I could not match to any weather pattern or astronomical event in the REACH database. "Burning skies," one of the terminal clerks reported, quoting a passenger directly. "That's what they keep saying. Burning skies and dead comms arrays." I pulled up the official broadcast channel on my secondary display. The new Alexandria Civil Authority feed was running a public service announcement on a loop. Routine military training exercises were being conducted in designated zones. Residents were advised to avoid restricted areas and continue normal activities. The announcement had the calm, measured cadence of every government broadcast I had ever heard, and I listened to it 3 times while the refugee reports accumulated on my board like water rising against a dam. Rhee appeared beside my station. He had left the podium, which meant someone else was running the central redirect. Or he had decided the redirects were past the point where central coordination mattered. His face carried the same composed authority it always did, but the skin around his mouth had drawn tight, and he kept glancing at the board the way a man checks a wound he has already decided not to discuss. "How many refugee entries?" he asked. 14 terminals reporting. Over 200 civilians logged in the last 20 minutes. Logistics will set up a processing line. keep the rail lines open to the perimeter staging areas, and flag anything that comes in without authorization for the emergency services teams. He said it the way he said everything, like a man reading from a manual he had memorized decades ago. Then he added, quieter. The official line is training exercises. I've seen the broadcast. So have the people arriving at the terminals. He looked at me for a moment, and whatever he decided to say next, he swallowed it. He went back to the podium. Officer Ward arrived from the station level below, uniform creased and dark with sweat under the arms, his face carrying the particular grey of a man who had been on his feet since before dawn. He spoke briefly with Ree, then moved between the coordinator stations, checking logs, confirming redirect codes, his voice level and mechanical. I watched him stop at Lena's console, ask a question, receive an answer, and move on without changing expression. He was doing his job the way I was doing mine, with the precise, automatic competence of someone who had stopped expecting the procedures to lead anywhere that made sense. The sensor ghosts appeared at 1012. I was cross-referencing refugee arrival points against the military redirect map when the atmospheric sensor feed began registering anomalies over the southern continent. Massive signatures, too large and too fast for human craft, burning through the upper atmosphere in trajectories that did not match any fleet movement I had ever been briefed on. The readings appeared for 11 seconds, degraded into noise, then surfaced again on a different vector. I could not identify them. I could not reconcile them with training exercises or routine maneuvers or any explanation that fit inside the world I had been living in that morning. I opened my comm log. The message to Mara sat where I had left it, unread, the delivery receipt still pending. She was at the medical distribution facility in Quadrant 4, the same one the 0615 supply run had serviced that morning, and she had not opened my message. I told myself the facility was busy. I told myself she was on shift and her comm was in a locker. I told myself several things, and none of them addressed the fact that the southern continent sensor anomalies were drifting north. Lena's console emitted a short, sharp tone I had never heard before. She stared at the readout, then turned to me. I've got 3 more terminal reports coming in. 40, 60, over 100 civilians each. Her voice came out flat, stripped of its usual speed. They're all describing the same thing. I looked at my board. The red shuttle indicators stared back, 17 lines grounded by an authority I could not question. The broadcast channel cycled through its loop again, and the calm voice of the civil authority filled the space between us, advising residents that the exercises were routine and would conclude within the designated window. The sensor feed on my secondary display registered another anomaly, larger than the last, and I watched it move across the grid toward New Alexandria. Descent into the underbelly. The steel door clanged shut behind me, and the sound traveled down the corridor in a long metallic wave that swallowed itself somewhere in the dark. I stood on the maintenance landing with my hand still on the lever, listening to the echo die. Above me, through 3 meters of reinforced concrete and the vascular tangle of conduit that kept New Alexandria breathing, the transit control center was still running. Lena's console would still be logging refugee counts. Ree would still be rerouting rail traffic onto emergency sidings. The broadcast loop would still be telling everyone that the exercises were routine. I let go of the lever. My palm left a damp print on the metal. The maintenance tunnels ran beneath the city like a second skeleton. Service corridors and junction chambers that I had walked for 11 years of annual inspections and descent into the underbelly emergency drills. I knew the grading of every passage, the location of every manual breaker, the places where the lighting ran on independent battery cells separate from the main grid. That knowledge was the only map I had now. Mara's facility sat in Quadrant 4 on the far side of the district, and every official channel I had tried in the last 3 hours had returned the same automated non-response. My messages sat unread. The comm lines to her medical distribution center produced nothing but a carrier tone that looped every 8 seconds and reset. I had left my console logged in. The session would time out at midnight. It seemed important that I had not shut it down properly, that somewhere in the system my credentials still showed active, as though I might come back. The tunnel stretched ahead in a vanishing perspective of bolted panels and cable runs. Emergency lighting painted the walls in a low, ruddy wash that threw my shadow long and thin across the floor grating. The air tasted of sealant compound and standing water. I walked for what must have been 20 minutes, passing junction markers I recognized from maintenance schedules, until I reached the sealed hatch at C junction where the power had failed. The panel beside the hatch was dead. No indicator lights, no response to my keycard. I pried the manual release cover with the edge of my transit badge, a trick I had learned from a pipe fitter named Garrick during a heat wave blackout 2 summers ago. The mechanism resisted, then gave. The hatch unsealed with a pressurized exhale that stirred the descent into the underbelly dust at my feet. Beyond it, the corridor went black. I found the emergency breaker panel by touch, ran my fingers over the raised labels until I reached the one marked AUX Grid 4-C and pulled the lever down. Somewhere deep in the wall, a generator coughed twice and caught. Ceiling strips fired in sequence down the corridor, each one buzzing to life a half-second after the last, and the passage opened up ahead of me in a chain of pale rectangles stretching into the distance. I was halfway through D-section when I heard the voices. Low, uneven, the kind of sound people make when they are trying to be quiet and failing, because fear has taken the precision out of them. I slowed. Around the next bend, 4 people sat in an alcove meant for pipe storage clearance. 2 women, a man with his arm bound in a strip torn from a jacket, and a child who could not have been older than 6. The child was asleep against one of the women, or unconscious, or simply beyond the point where the distinction mattered. "Are you transit?" the man asked. His voice came out rough, scraped thin. "I was." "Is the surface open? They told us to shelter, but nobody came back." I looked at the bandage on his arm. The fabric had soaked through. "Which terminal did you come from?" "East Concourse. They routed us down here during the second lockdown. That was hours ago." Descent into the underbelly. The woman holding the child said nothing. She watched me with the fixed attention of someone deciding whether I was a threat or a way out, and I could see her arriving at no firm conclusion. I told them the evacuation terminals were south, through E section, and that the maintenance corridors would keep them off the surface. I told them to follow the cable runs with the red bands, and that the auxiliary power would be on. I described the route in the kind of detail I had spent my career producing for shuttle drivers and freight dispatchers, the kind that accounted for every turn and hazard and distance marker. The man nodded. The woman with the child did not move until the other woman touched her elbow, and then she stood, slowly, lifting the child as she rose. They moved south. I watched them until the corridor took them, and then I turned north, toward Quadrant 4, and kept walking. The first explosion was a sound I felt in the floor before I heard it in the air. A low, rolling concussion that came through the concrete and the grating and the soles of my boots, followed 2 seconds later by a muffled report that seemed to flatten against the ceiling overhead. Dust sifted from the seams between panels. A second followed, farther east, and then a third that was not muffled at all but sharp and immediate, close enough that the ceiling strips along the corridor stuttered and 3 of them went dark. I stood in the stuttering light and counted the seconds. Descent into the underbelly between the last impact and the next silence. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the wall until they stopped, then pushed on into the darkening corridor, counting junction markers, moving toward Mara. Junction marker C14 had been spray-painted over so many times the stencil was barely legible, and I ran my thumb across the ridges of old paint while I waited for the tremor in my hands to stop. 3 explosions had passed through the floor in the last hour. Each one had come from a different direction, closer and sharper, and the ceiling panels between the last 2 junctions had cracked along their seams. Dust hung in the still air. I counted the cracks. 7, running parallel to the conduit housing, which meant the stress was lateral, coming from the east, from the surface. I filed that away and kept walking. The tunnels narrowed past C14, the service corridor dropping to a width that forced me to turn sideways where the pipe clusters jutted from the walls. I had walked this section during annual inspections for 11 years and remembered the choke points by the sound they made. A low whistle where the ventilation narrowed, a dull hum where the power conduits crossed overhead. The hum was gone now. The conduits were dead, or close to it, and the emergency strips bolted to the wall at ankle height gave just enough light to see the floor grating by. I found the first group at C17, huddled in an alcove behind a junction box where 2 maintenance corridors met. 6 people. 2 women, a man, 3 children pressed between them. One of the children was small enough that the woman holding her had tucked the girl's face against her shoulder. Though the girl was awake, her eyes tracking me as I slowed. A scrape on her forehead had dried brown. She did not cry. None of them did. The silence was the kind that came after people had used up all their words on each other and found them insufficient. "How far to the evacuation terminals?" the man asked. His voice was level, but he asked it the way someone asks for a prognosis. "South through E section. Follow this corridor to junction D3, take the left branch, and keep going until you hit the freight elevator. It should still be on emergency power." "Should be." I can't promise more than that. The emergency circuits are holding for now. The woman with the child stood. The girl's legs dangled against her hip, too long for carrying, but the woman did not set her down. "We came from the Asod line. They told us to get off at the junction and walk." They were right. The junction terminal is compromised. Stay in the tunnels until D-3, then go up. They moved out single file, the man leading and the second woman bringing up the rear with one hand on the wall. I watched them until the corridor bent and took them from view. The girl's scrape needed cleaning. I had no supplies. I turned north. Mara's facility was in Quadrant 4, 40 kilometers from the city center by surface route, less than half that through the maintenance network if the corridors held. I had been calculating distances in my head since the first explosion, adding and subtracting based on which sections I could confirm were still passable. The math kept changing. A section I had counted on 20 minutes ago might be rubble now, and I had no way to know until I reached it. At D-1, the corridor flooded. Ankle-deep water, warm and tasting of metal when I knelt to test it with one finger. A pipe burst upstream, or a surface breach had found a drain. I backtracked to C-19 and rerouted through a power distribution substation that I remembered had a raised platform along its eastern wall. The platform was there, dry, and I crossed the room on it, stepping over junction boxes and cable bundles that I had once inventoried on a clipboard, ticking off serial numbers. The clipboard felt like something from another decade, though it had been 3 months. Another group found me at the substation. 11 people this time, emerging from a cross-tunnel that connected to the residential blocks above. They had come down through a maintenance access in a parking structure. One of them, a man in a transit worker's vest, had blood on his sleeve that did not appear to be his own. "You know these tunnels?" he asked. "I work transit infrastructure. I've inspected most of this network." "Then you're exactly who we need. We've been walking for 2 hours. Some of these people can't keep going much longer." I looked at the group. An older man leaning on a younger woman's arm, his breathing shallow and audible. A teenager carrying a duffel that was too heavy for her frame. A woman with a limp who had fashioned a splint from what looked like a transit seat bracket and electrical tape. The child from the first group had a scrape. These people had worse. "There's a freight elevator at D3, south of here. It runs on emergency power. From the surface you can reach the evacuation terminals in E section. Stay on the raised platform through this room, take the corridor at the far end, and count 4 junctions. D3 will be marked on the wall at chest height." The man in the vest nodded and repeated the directions back to me, word for word, until he had them right. I gave him the code for the manual release on the elevator hatch in case the panel was dead. He wrote it on his forearm with a pen he pulled from his vest pocket. They moved out. The woman with the splint was last, and she looked at me as she passed. "Are you coming?" "I have to go north. My sister works at a medical facility in Quadrant 4. I have to reach her." The woman did not argue. She nodded once and followed the others into the corridor. I stood in the substation alone, listening to their footsteps recede, until the only sound was water dripping from the platform into the flooded floor below. I pressed north. The corridors between D1 and D5 were older, part of the original construction, and the emergency strips here ran on a separate circuit that I had complained about in 3 inspection reports for being unreliable. The strips were working, which meant the circuit was intact, which meant the junction ahead was probably passable. I noted the contradiction between my reports and reality, and kept walking. At D4 I heard boots, not the shuffling, uncertain tread of civilians, but a coordinated rhythm, multiple sets, moving fast. I pressed myself against the wall beside a pipe housing and waited. 6 soldiers came through the cross-tunnel at a jog, their gear clattering, their faces set and blank. They did not look at me. They did not slow. One of them had a torn sleeve and dried blood on his gauntlet. They moved with the urgency of people heading away from something, and the direction they were traveling was south, toward the evacuation terminals, away from the city center. I watched them pass. The official broadcasts had called it training exercises. The soldiers retreating through maintenance tunnels at a jog, not speaking, not stopping, told a different story. I had known the broadcasts were lies since the first override codes hit the grid, but knowing and seeing were separate things, and the distance between them closed in the sound of those boots. Thomas reappeared at the next junction. I recognized him by his silhouette first, the weathered set of his shoulders and the way he stood with his weight on his left foot, favoring the right, an old injury I had seen him compensate for across years of shift briefings. He stepped out of the cross corridor at D5 and stopped when he saw me. "Venn, you're still down here." "I'm heading for Quadrant 4, Mara's facility." He looked at me the way he looked at a technician who had proposed bypassing a safety protocol. "This section is compromised. I've been pulling teams south for the last hour. The structural integrity past D6 is questionable." "I can get through. The substation circuits are still live. If the power's on, the corridors are intact." "The power being on doesn't mean the ceiling isn't cracked. We felt 2 impacts from below the water table before I pulled my team out. I know the bypass routes, every junction, every manual release. I can read the stress fractures by the crack patterns." Thomas studied me. His face gave nothing, but he did not tell me to turn around. That silence was new. For 11 years, Thomas had ended conversations by giving an order. The absence of one said more than any directive could. "D7 is flooded. D8 has a partial collapse on the north branch. Take the eastern branch at D6 and you might clear it." He turned south. I watched him go, his right foot favoring the left now, the limp worse than I remembered. He did not look back. I took the eastern branch at D6. The ceiling here was intact, but the walls had shifted, a lateral displacement of 2 centimeters that I measured by eye from the gap between 2 panel seams. The corridor groaned, a low structural complaint that traveled through the concrete and into my boots. Ahead, the emergency strips gave out, and I stood at the edge of the dark, listening to the tunnel breathe around me, a sound of air being pushed through spaces that were narrowing. I pulled my jacket sleeve over my hand and felt along the wall for the manual release on the next hatch. The metal was warm, which meant something on the other side was generating heat. I found the release lever, pushed it counterclockwise, and felt the mechanism give. The hatch swung inward 6 centimeters and stopped, blocked by debris on the far side. I put my shoulder into it and forced it another 20. The gap was enough to slide through. On the other side, the corridor was dry, the strips working, the air warm and thick with the smell of heated concrete. I moved forward into it, toward Quadrant 4, toward Mara, counting junctions in the dark. Hours had passed since the hatch at D6. I had spent them guiding a ragged convoy of civilian transit vehicles through the maintenance tunnels, 6 of them in a line, their headlamps carving cones of light through dust that had not settled in 11 years. The people inside had no training for this. I walked ahead of the lead vehicle on foot, reading the junction markers, testing the floor plates with my weight before waving them forward. Twice I had to reroute us around flooded corridors where the water had risen past the wheel hubs. The convoy was fragile, a procession of cargo haulers and maintenance carts packed with people who had been told nothing except to run. Through a ventilation shaft near D9, I had seen the skyline of New Alexandria, and the silhouettes of Covenant ships hung above it like a fleet of black crescents, so large and so still they could have been a second horizon. The convoy reached the freight elevator at the junction I had directed the earlier groups toward, and I watched the last vehicle descend before I turned north toward Quadrant 4. The Medical Logistics Center occupied the lower 2 floors of a municipal services building in Quadrant 4. I had been here once, 8 months ago, to meet Mara for lunch. She had shown me the warehouse floors, the automated sorting lines, the cold storage units where regional medical supplies were staged for distribution. The facility had smelled of antiseptic and packaging material. It had been clean, bright, and full of people who knew exactly what they were doing. The stairwell door was ajar. Beyond it, the corridor was covered in ceiling tiles and powdered concrete. A section of the overhead lighting track had come down and lay across the hallway at chest height, still attached to its conduit by a few wires. I stepped over it and moved into the main warehouse. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the emergency strips along the baseboards. The sorting lines were idle, their conveyor belts stopped mid-load, boxes of sealed medical supplies sitting where the automation had quit. No staff, no patients, no voices. "Mara!" I called out, and the sound came back flat from the concrete walls. I said her name again, louder, and then a third time, until my voice cracked on the vowel. Nothing answered. I moved through the warehouse, checking the cold storage units, the break room, the loading dock. The dock door was buckled inward, its track bent by a structural shift in the frame. A gurney lay on its side near the far wall, its IV pole bent at a right angle. I checked behind it, under it, in the supply closet next to it. I called her name until it stopped sounding like a word. On the floor near the supervisor's station, a data pad lay face down in a film of concrete dust. The screen was cracked but active. I picked it up and wiped the glass with my sleeve. The log entry was partial, the last few characters cut off where the damage had reached the display. It read, "Evac order received 1347 Military Authority Sigma 7 all personnel report to staging area immediate transport. Priority military casualties. No civilian transport allocated repeat. No civilian." The entry ended there. I read it twice. The timestamp was from earlier this afternoon, hours ago. The military had ordered the staff out and given them no way to take the patients. I set the pad down on the desk and stood there for a long time. A sound reached me from behind the fallen gurney, a small shift of fabric against tile. I turned and saw a child there, maybe 5 or 6 years old, sitting with their knees drawn up and a tattered stuffed animal held against their chest. The child's face was streaked with dust. A cut above the left eyebrow had dried brown, and the skin around it was swollen. They looked at me without speaking, their mouth slightly open, their fingers tight on the toy. I crouched where I was, about 3 meters away, and kept my hands visible. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected. The child did not move. I stayed down and waited. After a while I said, I work for the city. I know these buildings. I can get us out of here." The child's eyes went to the door behind me, then back. I did not know what they had seen in the hours they had spent alone in this room. I did not ask. Mara was not here. The staff had been pulled out by military order, and the patients had been left. I could not search every floor of every building in Quadrant 4. I could not find her by walking through rubble and calling a name into rooms that gave nothing back. The child was here, and the child was hurt, and I knew the maintenance tunnels and the freight routes and the junction codes. I knew how to move people through failing infrastructure because I had been doing it all day. I let that knowledge settle into the place where the searching had been, and I stood up slowly. "Can you walk?" I asked. The child nodded, a small movement. I held out my hand, and after a moment that lasted longer than it should have, they reached for it. Their fingers were cold and gripped mine hard. I led them toward the stairwell, past the buckled dock door and the idle sorting lines, and we started south. The evacuation terminals in E section were the last option I knew of. If any transport vessels were still lifting from reach, they would be there. Darkness in the interchange smoke found us before the interchange did. It rolled through the corridor in low, fat tendrils that clung to the floor and wrapped around our ankles, carrying a chemical sweetness that coated the back of my tongue. The child coughed against my leg, a small barking sound they tried to muffle with their sleeve. I tightened my grip on their hand and kept moving. The transit interchange was 200 meters ahead, a hub I had routed freight through 1,000 times without ever setting foot inside its passenger galleries. I knew its layout from schematics. I knew its junction codes. I did not know what it looked like with its guts torn out. We came in through the north service entrance, a freight door I had to crank open by hand because the motor was dead. The hinges screamed. Inside, the interchange opened into a cathedral of industrial architecture. Vaulted ceilings supported by ribbed columns that rose into shadow. The darkness in the interchange space had been designed for thousands of commuters moving between 6 transit lines. I could see the remains of that design. Vendor stalls with their shutters torn down, departure boards frozen mid-scroll, benches overturned and stacked into barricades by people who had tried to hold a position here before moving on or being moved. Scorch marks climbed the eastern wall in a tongue of soot that reached the second-level walkway. The air was warm and tasted of burnt polymer. There were others. I counted 11 before I stopped counting. They emerged from behind pillars and collapsed ticket counters, drawn by the sound of the freight door. A woman with a bloodied shirt pressed to her forearm. 2 men in warehouse coveralls. A family of 4 huddled near a defunct information kiosk, the parents standing in front of the children with the practiced geometry of bodies shielding smaller ones. A few others I registered only as shapes in the dim perimeter light, faces I did not look at long enough to remember. Lena Orr stepped out from behind a support column near the east platform access. Her diagnostics console uniform was torn at the shoulder, and she held a length of pipe in her left hand. She lowered it when she recognized me. "Venn, I thought you went north." "I came back south, through the tunnels." I gestured at the child beside me. "I need to get this group to the evacuation terminals in E section." She looked at the child, then at the others who had. Darkness in the interchange gathered closer. The south platforms are sealed. Airlock C-14 dropped about 20 minutes ago. Whole section is locked down. What triggered the seal? Explosion somewhere above us. The automated system read it as a containment breach and cycled the locks. She set the pipe down against the column. I tried the manual release on the platform side. Nothing. The mechanism needs power, and we're running on batteries that won't last another hour. I looked up. The emergency lighting ran on a chain of battery-backed fixtures, each one a dim rectangle of illumination that turned the interchange into a landscape of pools and shadows. I could hear the Covenant in the distance, a rhythmic bass note that I had learned to recognize over the past hours. Plasma charges hitting something structural. The sound came from the east, from the direction of the city center, and each impact sent a fine grit sifting from the ceiling. The child pressed closer to my leg. I put my hand on their shoulder. The maintenance shaft, I said. Above the east platform, there's an access hatch that leads to the manual override for the C-Series airlocks. If I can get up there, I can cycle the seal from the mechanical side. Lena stared at me. You're sure that's still there? The shaft is structural. It's part of the building frame, not the power grid. Unless the frame itself is gone, the shaft and darkness in the interchange, the manual actuator will be there. Unless the frame itself is gone, she repeated. I nodded. It was the honest answer. The first battery fixture died. It went dark without ceremony, the light simply ceasing, and the pool it had cast on the industrial floor disappeared. Then the one next to it. A woman in the group made a sound, a sharp intake that she cut short. The child's fingers dug into my calf. I could feel the tremor in their grip, a vibration that traveled up through the muscle into my hip. They're going out, Lena said. She moved to the nearest column and pulled the pipe back up, not as a weapon, but as something to hold. The whole backup chain is failing. How long do you need? 10 minutes, maybe 15. For what? To climb 4 levels in the dark, find a manual actuator I've never physically touched, and crank open an airlock that weighs 3 tons. She looked at the group behind me. The family had pressed closer together. The woman with the injured arm was sitting now, her back against the information kiosk, her face slick with sweat. The 2 men in coveralls stood near the sealed platform door, one of them running his hands along its seams as if he might find a gap that reason said was not there. I'll keep them here, Lena said. Go. I knelt down. The child's face was level with mine. There. Darkness in the interchange features half visible in the failing light. I could see the abrasions along their jawline, the dried blood at the temple I had cleaned hours ago in a building that no longer existed. I need you to stay with her. I tilted my head toward Lena. I'm going up into the shaft to open the door. When it opens, we move. All of us. Can you do that? The child looked at me. Their mouth opened and closed. They nodded. I'll be back. I stood and crossed the interchange floor toward the east platform access. The shaft entrance was where the schematics said it would be. A narrow hatch set into the wall behind a panel I had to pry loose with my fingers. The metal was warm. Behind it, the shaft rose vertically into blackness, a ladder of welded rungs disappearing into a column of air that smelled of heated wiring and old sealant. I could feel heat radiating from somewhere above, a residual warmth that spoke of energy weapons or ruptured conduits or both. I gripped the first rung. The metal bit into my palm, rough with corrosion at the weld points. I pulled myself up. The rungs were spaced 40 centimeters apart, standard transit construction, and I climbed by count. 10 rungs to the first landing, 20 to the second. The shaft was narrow enough that my shoulders brushed both walls, and the sound of my breathing came back to me from the surfaces around me, amplified and strange. At the third level, the ladder shuddered. Something had hit the building hard enough to transmit through the frame, darkness in the interchange, and I stopped with both hands tight on the rungs and my feet braced against the one below. Grit rained into my hair. I waited. The shuddering stopped. I kept climbing. The fourth level was where the actuator housing sat. I found it by feel, a rectangular box bolted to the shaft wall, its surface warm under my hands. The manual release was a wheel recessed into the housing, a mechanical switch that bypassed every electronic system in the interchange. I had read about it in a maintenance manual 3 years ago during a certification course I took, because Thomas Rhee told me it would look good on my annual review. I had never expected to use it. I had certainly never expected to use it in the dark. 4 levels above a floor full of people I was responsible for, while the building shook around me. I placed both hands on the wheel and turned. It moved a quarter rotation and stopped. I adjusted my footing on the rung, leaned my weight into it, and turned again. A grinding sound came from inside the housing, metal on metal, and the wheel crept another quarter turn. The actuator was engaging. Somewhere below me, somewhere in the walls of the interchange, a 3-ton airlock was beginning to unlatch. I kept turning. The wheel fought me for every degree, and my shoulders burned with the effort. Below, far below, I heard a sound I could not identify at first. Voices. Not screaming, not shouting. A low collective murmur that rose through the shaft like air pressure changing. The airlock was moving. They could hear it. Darkness in the interchange. I gave the wheel one more rotation and felt the mechanism catch and hold. The lock was open. I gripped the ladder and started down, counting rungs in the dark, my hands raw and my arms shaking. The interchange below was black. Every battery fixture had died. I descended toward the sound of those voices, toward the child whose hand I had felt on my leg and could no longer feel. And when I reached the bottom rung, I dropped to the floor and stood in the absolute dark of a building I had spent my career keeping alive. Venn? Lena's voice, close to my left. It's open. Move south. Stay against the west wall. The platform corridor leads to E section. I heard them stand. I heard the scrape of shoes on the floor, the child's small cough, the woman with the injured arm breathing in short pulls. I reached out and found the wall, and I started walking. The airlock groaned open, and the light on the other side was the color of old iodine, thin and sickly, falling across a floor littered with debris and bodies that were still moving. I stepped through with the child pressed against my leg, her fingers bunched in the fabric of my pants, and the air that hit my face carried the iron tang of blood and the sweet chemical edge of field antiseptic. The space beyond was a transit hall repurposed into something it was never built for. Cots lined the walls in uneven rows. IV stands had been lashed to support columns with electrical tape. People lay on blankets spread over the industrial floor, and the sound of them, the low collective murmur of hurt and exhaustion, filled the chamber like a second atmosphere. I scanned the faces I could see. A man with a pressure dressing wrapped around his forearm sat upright against a supply crate, staring at nothing. 2 women shared a single cot, one of them holding the other's hand, neither of them speaking. I moved down the central aisle, the child following, and I checked each face against the one I carried in my head. 24 years old, determined expression, hair that she never quite kept in place. I had been looking for her since the medical logistics center turned out to be a shell, since the data pad with the 1347 evacuation order told me the staff had left, and that she had been left with them. The far end of the hall opened into a secondary bay, where the ceiling was lower and the lighting worse. More wounded, more blankets on the floor. A man with burns across half his neck was being tended by someone whose back was turned, someone kneeling beside a gurney with a kit of supplies laid out in a neat row. I stopped walking. The posture was wrong for a stranger. The shoulders were too narrow, the angle of the head too familiar. And when the person shifted to reach for a gauze pad, I saw the edge of a face I had known my whole life. Mara. She looked up. Her eyes found me, and for a long moment she did not move, did not speak, just knelt there with the gauze in her hand and her mouth slightly open. Then her face broke into something that was not quite a smile. She set the gauze down and stood, and her hands were shaking when she reached for me. I pulled her in and held her against my chest, and the child at my leg pressed closer too, and for a few seconds the 3 of us stood in the middle of that terrible room while people bled and groaned around us, and I did not let go. "I thought you were gone," I said. "I almost was." Her voice came out hoarse, scraped thin. "The staff pulled out at the evacuation order. They told us to follow. Some of us couldn't walk." She pulled back and looked at me, and I saw what the hours had done to her. She was 24, and she looked older. Her uniform was torn at the shoulder and stained with something dark that had dried. Her hands kept working at the edge of her sleeve, even when she was not holding anything, a repetitive motion she did not seem to notice. I turned to the bay behind her. 7 wounded on the floor, 2 on gurneys. An older man propped against the wall with a splint on his lower leg, watching us. A young woman with a head dressing who had not opened her eyes. These were the people the medical staff had left behind, the ones who could not move fast enough, and Mara had stayed with them. "We need to go," I said. "There's a transport vessel at the south platforms. It may be the last one." "I know." She looked back at the wounded. "They can't all walk." "How many can move at all?" 5, maybe 6. The 2 on the gurneys won't make it without help carrying them. I counted the distance in my head. The platform corridor ran south from E section, maybe 400 meters of open concourse. I had walked those corridors on routine inspections for years. I knew the grade changes, the junction points, the places where the floor narrowed. I could map the route. What I could not do was carry 2 unconscious people 400 meters while Covenant patrols closed in from the north. A sound reached us then, low and rhythmic, something between a drone and a chant, filtered through the walls and the floor. The child pressed harder against my leg. I had heard it before, in the maintenance tunnels, growing louder as we moved south. It was not a machine sound. It carried a pattern that did not belong to anything human. "That's been getting closer for an hour," Mara said. Officer Ward appeared at the entrance to the bay. His uniform was torn at the collar, and he moved with the deliberate care of someone who had been awake far past the point where sleep would have done any good. He carried a flashlight in one hand and a sidearm in the other, and he did not raise either of them when he saw me. "You're the transit man," he said. "Elias. I need the south platform corridor clear for these people." "It's clear. Won't stay that way." He glanced over his shoulder toward the main hall. "I've been pulling stragglers in from the north concourse for the last 2 hours. Whatever's out there is methodical. They're sweeping section by section." "How long do we have?" "I stopped guessing about 20 minutes ago." He said it without inflection, without drama, the way a man speaks when he has run out of the energy required to make things sound worse or better than they are. He looked at Mara, at the wounded behind her, at the child at my leg. "I can help carry the ones on the gurneys," he said, "but we go now or we don't go." I turned to Mara. "You can't stay with them." "I'm not leaving them." "If you stay, you die here. All of you. The transport is the only chance, and it won't wait." "So we carry them." 2 unconscious adults, 400 meters, with Covenant patrols closing from the north. You know what that looks like. She did not answer right away. Her jaw worked, and she looked at the young woman with the head dressing, the one who had not opened her eyes. Then she looked at the older man with the splint, who was watching us with the expression of someone who understood exactly what was being decided about him. "I can get the walkers moving," she said. "The 2 on the gurneys. I need 2 people to carry each." "Ward and I can take one. I need 2 more for the second." Ward was already moving toward the main hall. "I'll find them." Mara knelt beside the man with the splint. "Can you walk if I help you?" "I can walk," he said. She moved to the next cot, and the next, speaking to each person in a voice that had dropped to almost nothing, low and direct, the voice of someone who had spent years telling frightened people things they did not want to hear. I watched her work, and I saw what had changed. She was not the confident logistics coordinator who organized supply runs to Quadrant 4. She was someone else now, someone harder and more fragile at the same time, and the difference was visible in the way her hands moved and the way she did not meet anyone's eyes for more than a second. I counted the people in the bay. 9, including the child. 2 on gurneys. 5 who could walk with assistance. 2 who could walk without. I ran the route in my head again, mapping the junctions, the width of the corridor, the single set of stairs at the midpoint where the floor rose to meet the platform level. The stairs would be the problem. A gurney on a staircase with hostiles closing behind. I had moved freight through those corridors, pallets of medical supplies on automated dollies, and I knew the load ratings and the turning radius for every junction. A gurney was narrower than a pallet. It would fit. The stairs were the variable. The chanting sound through the walls grew louder, or perhaps closer, and the floor transmitted a vibration that I felt in the soles of my boots. The child looked up at me. I put my hand on her head. Ward came back with 2 men from the main hall. One was limping but could carry. The other was young and unmarked and had the look of someone who had not yet understood what was happening. Ward pointed them toward the second gurney without explanation. "South corridor, single file," I said. "I go first. Ward, you take rear. Nobody stops. If the floor rises, we take the stairs 2 at a time, and we do not set the gurneys down." Mara finished securing the last of the walkers. She slung a supply bag over her shoulder and took the arm of the man with the splint. He leaned on her, and she took his weight without shifting. "Ready," she said. I looked south down the corridor. The lighting held, barely, and the passage stretched into a distance I could not see the end of. The transport was out there somewhere, and the last corridor between here and there was the one I had to get them through. I started walking, and behind me I heard them follow, the scrape of shoes and the creak of gurney wheels and the quiet breathing of people who understood that this was the last movement they would make together, one way or another. The south platform corridor ended at a set of heavy freight doors that stood open onto the tarmac, and beyond them, the last transport vessel sat with its engines already turning, a deep mechanical growl that I could feel in the floor plates before I heard it properly. The pre-dawn sky had gone the color of a bruise, dark purple at the edges, lighter where the city's fires pushed light upward against the cloud cover. I counted the people behind me as they came through the doorway. 9. All of them still moving. Mara came through last, one hand on the gurney rail, the other holding the injured child against her shoulder. The child had stopped crying somewhere in the corridor. That silence worried me more than the noise had. Lena Orr was already at the base of the transport's ramp, waving the first evacuees forward with sharp, efficient gestures I would not have recognized from the woman who used to sit 2 consoles away from mine, running diagnostics with her headset half on. She had changed. We all had. "Ramp's clear," Lena called back. "Get them up. All of them." Ward appeared from behind the freight doors, uniform torn at the left shoulder, and took the gurney from Mara without a word. He pushed it up the ramp, the wheels catching once on a seam in the plating before clearing the deck. Mara followed with the child. I stood at the threshold and watched them go, one by one, the 5 who needed assistance, the 2 who could walk, then Ward and the gurney, and Mara and the child. The sound reached us before anything else. A high, layered shrieking that did not belong to any machinery I knew. It came from the north end of the terminal concourse, behind us, and it was getting closer. I turned. The far entrance to the platform level, 200 meters back along the corridor, had been a sealed bulkhead when we came through. Now the center panel was buckled inward, the metal warped in a shape that looked almost deliberate, as if something had pressed against it from the other side with tremendous patience. "Move," I said, loud enough for everyone on the ramp to hear. "Get on the ship, now." The evacuees accelerated. I could hear their footsteps on the ramp metal, quick and uneven. Lena grabbed a woman who had stumbled and pulled her upright without slowing. The bulkhead panel tore free. The sound it made was enormous, a grinding shriek of torn fasteners that echoed through the platform level. Through the gap, I could see them. Tall, armored figures moving in a formation that was too precise, too synchronized, to mistake for anything human. Their weapons cast a blue-white light across the concourse floor. A blast door between the breached bulkhead and the platform began to descend. The automatic safety system had triggered, responding to the structural breach. I knew this system. I had studied it 3 years ago in the certification course, the one that covered manual overrides for C-series airlocks and emergency blast barriers. The door was designed to seal the platform level in exactly this kind of event, to compartmentalize the damage. It would trap the Covenant on the other side. It would also trap anyone still on the platform. I ran for the manual override panel set into the wall beside the descending door. The panel cover was a recessed steel box at waist height. I slapped it open and found the actuator handle inside, a heavy mechanical switch that controlled the hydraulic seal. The door was already 1.5 meters down from the ceiling, dropping at a rate I estimated at 15 centimeters per second. In 8 seconds, no one over the height of a child would fit beneath it. I grabbed the actuator and pulled. The handle moved about 5 degrees and stopped. The hydraulic pressure was fighting me. I braced my foot against the wall below the panel and pulled again. Both hands, my full weight. The handle moved another 10 degrees. The door's descent slowed. "Elias," Mara's voice from the ramp. "Get them on the ship," I said. I did not look back. The handle had a locking position at 90 degrees. I was at maybe 30. I adjusted my grip, wrapped my fingers around the base of the actuator where the metal was narrower, and pulled with everything I had. My arms shook. Something in my right shoulder made a sound I did not want to think about. The handle crept to 45 degrees. The door stopped descending. It held there, half open, 3 meters of clearance between the bottom edge and the floor. Enough for people to pass through. Not enough for the Covenant to bring anything larger than infantry through quickly. I could see the transport through the gap. The ramp was still down. Mara was at the top of it, the child in her arms, looking back at me. The last 2 evacuees were crossing the tarmac. Ward behind them, his sidearm drawn and pointed at nothing. The shrieking from the concourse was louder now. I could hear plasma fire, the distinctive crackle of weapons discharge, and the sound of metal being heated past its tolerance. The air coming through the gap smelled hot and sharp, a chemical bite that coated my tongue. "Mara, get on the ship," I said. She did not move. She stood at the top of the ramp with the child and looked at me across 30 meters of tarmac, and I could see her face in the light from the transport's open hatch. She understood. I could tell she understood because she did not argue. She turned and carried the child inside. Lena appeared at the ramp's edge. She looked at me, then at the blast door I was holding, then at the corridor behind me where the blue-white light was growing. She said something to Ward I could not hear. Ward looked toward me once, then turned and went inside. The transport's engines changed pitch. The ramp began to rise, hydraulic arms folding it upward against the hull. I watched it close. Mara was inside. The child was inside. All 9 of them were inside. The actuator handle was biting into my palms. I had locked my arms straight, my back against the wall, my feet braced on the floor plates. The door wanted to close. The hydraulic system was a constant, grinding pressure against my grip. I held it. The transport lifted. I felt it before I saw it, a vibration in the floor that rose through my feet and legs, and then the ship was above me, its belly grey and featureless in the dim light, climbing on a column of thrust that sent debris skidding across the tarmac. The ramp was sealed. The hatch was closed. They were off the ground. The blast door's hydraulic system cycled to full pressure. I felt the handle begin to slip in my hands, 1 degree at a time. The gap beneath the door was shrinking. I held the actuator and watched the transport climb, its engines bright against the bruised sky, growing smaller as it rose above the terminal buildings, above the fires, above the city I had lived in for 31 years. The first plasma round struck the wall 2 meters to my left. The masonry cracked and sagged inward. I did not let go of the handle. The transport was a point of light now, climbing through the high atmosphere, heading for orbit. I watched it until my eyes watered and the point blurred, and then I kept watching anyway, my hands locked on the actuator, my back against the wall, the door half open behind me, and the sound of the Covenant filling the corridor. The hydraulic actuator gave out at some point, and I let go of the handle because there was nothing left to hold. The blast door ground down the rest of the way on its own weight, 3 tons of alloy dropping the final centimeters, with the sound that traveled through the floor and up through the soles of my boots. I stepped back from the manual override panel. My hands stayed open at my sides. The corridor beyond the sealed door was quiet. The plasma fire had stopped. The chanting had stopped. Everything that had been alive and moving and burning on the other side of that barrier had gone silent, and I stood in the quiet for a long time before I understood what that meant. I found the maintenance bunker 20 meters down the service corridor, behind a pressure door marked with a faded stencil that read AUX Grid 4-C. The manual release required the certification I had earned 3 years ago, the same course that taught me the spacing of the ladder bars and the weight of the C-series airlocks. My hands remembered the sequence before my head caught up. I pulled the release, cycled the lock twice, and stepped inside. The air was stale and close, thick with particulate that had been settling in the ventilation shafts for years. The bunker had been built for exactly this kind of moment, a sealed pocket in the secondary skeleton of the city, and it had been waiting through all the years when no one believed it would be needed. The air recyclers came on with a low mechanical churn that settled into a constant, even rhythm. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and listened to it. The bunker had no windows. A single status panel on the far wall showed the air filtration cycling at capacity, the power cell reading at 83%, the external temperature holding at nominal. I read the numbers more times than I needed to. They were the only thing in the room that changed. I did not know how long I sat there. The recyclers counted the time in their steady rotations, and I let them. At some point I reached for the pad I had been carrying since the transit control center and opened it to the emergency evac order I had recorded, the one stamped 1347, the one that had started all of this. The screen's glow caught the grit on my fingers. I closed the pad and set it on the floor beside me. There was nothing on it I needed to read again. The power cell dropped to 81% before I moved. I stood up and went to the bunker's outer door, the one that opened back toward the corridor and the city beyond it. The manual override required both hands on the release wheel. I turned it counterclockwise, felt the locking pins retract one by one through the resistance in the wheel, and pulled. The door groaned on its track, a low, grinding complaint from metal that had not moved in years, and the outside came in. Ash and the sharp, sulphuric bite of burned polymer. No wind. The corridor beyond was intact, but empty, the luminescent markers on the walls still casting their dim light across the industrial floor. I walked the length of it, through the junction where the service tunnel met the main transit artery, and stopped where the passage opened onto the surface level of New Alexandria. The skyline was wrong. I knew the shape of it from 31 years of looking up at it, the way the towers stepped down from the financial district to the residential bands, the way the transit spires caught the light at certain hours. The towers were still there, most of them. But the silhouette had been broken, the upper thirds of 3 buildings sheared away, and the gaps between them were filled with smoke that rose in slow, vertical columns from fires I could not see. The streets were empty. Debris covered the hardscape in a scattered layer of glass and masonry, and the bent frames of transit vehicles left where they had stopped. No people. No Covenant patrols. No official vehicles. No civil authority broadcasts. No voices. I walked out into it. My boots crunched on something that might have been glass or might have been something else. The air tasted of ash and the chemical aftermath of plasma discharge, a dry, acrid residue that coated the tongue. I passed a transit kiosk on the corner of what had been a pedestrian concourse, its screen dark, its housing cracked. A supply crate sat on its side near the curb, contents spilled across the walkway. I did not stop to look at what had been inside. The sky was clear. I tilted my head back and looked up, and there was nothing there. No transports climbing for orbit, no Covenant dropships descending through the clouds, no fighters, no flashes of weapons discharge in the upper atmosphere. Just the open expanse above the smoke, stars beginning to show through the gaps in the haze. I stood in the middle of the empty street and looked at them for a long time. Mara was on that transport, the 9 people, the child on the gurney, the ones who could walk and the ones who could not. They were past the atmosphere now, past the range of anything I could verify or track from a maintenance bunker with a single status panel and a power cell reading 81%. I had done the one thing I knew how to do. I had read the layouts, found the route, held the door. No one would record it. The transit logs were gone. The console at Station 7 had gone dark with everything else. Whatever I had done to get those people to the south platform corridor and onto that ship existed only in the memory of the people who had been there, and some of them had been too injured to remember much of anything. I walked farther. The street opened onto a plaza I recognized, the one with the transit interchange I had coordinated traffic through every working day for years. The interchange was gutted. The support columns stood, but the roof had collapsed inward, and the platforms below were buried under twisted metal and shattered panels. A single emergency light still burned at the far end of the wreckage, casting its dim glow across the rubble. I stopped at the edge of the plaza. The light reflected off the debris in small, broken fragments, and I watched them until my eyes adjusted, and the fragments became individual pieces of a structure I had once known well enough to navigate in the dark. I turned south toward where the evacuation terminals had been. There was nothing to find there. I knew that, but my feet carried me in that direction anyway, through the empty street, past the silent kiosks and the broken storefronts and the columns of smoke rising straight into the windless air. Somewhere ahead, the terminals would be rubble too. I kept walking,